Threads is one of those moments in time where you get to throw a bunch of people together and this incredible creative force comes out of it, because it's the right time in these people's lives, which may not happen the year before, a year later, but it's the right moment with experience, creative force, writing, and the meaningfulness of the story that we're trying to create, something extraordinary happens. The story we're trying to tell. And they gave us this area of buildings which are going to be knocked down. So we basically gave us a sort of playground of setting fire to stuff and breaking holes in buildings and rubble and using basements and a lot of the stuff you see there is in this one area. It looks like lots of different areas, but it's one reasonably small area, but it's a Hillsborough estate in Sheffield, which they gave over to us because they're going to demolish it anyway, so let us while we're making Threads, to help them demolish it and set fire to it. But one of my abiding memories is that next door was a Bassett's factory, and whenever I smell a licorice all sort now, it takes me immediately back to shooting Threads in that Hillsborough estate next to the Bassett's factory. Barry Hines, the writer, was not involved directly during the shooting, although obviously during prep and during mix research for it, he was involved deeply.
Was talking about it. Even now, people are still responding. I mean, within the last 10 years, one of my youngest son's friends said, you've got a BAFTA for the film that terrified a generation. You should be ashamed. So it is still relevant. I mean, people still talk to me about it. People quite often are, oh, you design films, what did you do? And if I say Threads, oh, my God, you did that. You know, it is still a very significant film. And I also think, having watched it again, it lives in its own sort of time warp, which I think is it was as significant today. In fact, it was more so, because when I watched it the first time, I probably had every line of the script in my head, so I knew what was going to happen minute by minute. To watch it again fresh and cold was absolutely stunning. The first time I watched it, I couldn't speak for half an hour. I think that's the effect it has on most people, and it still does today. I sincerely hope that Threads played a part in informing, it sounds pretentious, but informing the world what this would actually involve.
The Radio Times was a publication at the time was devoted entirely to the output of the BBC. In later years it was privatised, the connection with the BBC was severed, and it started to cover all other TV channels as well. But at the time it was the official organ of the BBC that told you what was going to be on in the coming week. So it was a listings magazine with features and interviews. It had, at the time, a bit like the BBC, a reputation that was kind of slightly granny-ish, slightly auntie-ish. The term of endearment for the BBC at the time was Auntie Beeb, which gives you an idea of how the BBC positioned itself and how people treat it as a broadcasting phenomenon, part of the family, part of the furniture. Consequently, the Radio Times always looks rather staid. It was generally, the covers would have images of, light entertainment stars or people in the popular eye at the moment, and they were generally sort of very light, frothy, or rather staid and sensible covers. And so this cover for Threads actually broke the mould quite significantly at the time. And it shows in a way, I think, that the BBC knew that they had something potentially incendiary on their hands, and they wanted to ensure that people were going into the programme with no illusions about what they were in for. Now, back in the 1960s, the BBC had commissioned a show called The War Game by a director called Peter Watkins. This was meant to be a TV documentary about the effects of a nuclear attack on the UK.
9:16 a.m. A single megaton nuclear missile overshoots Manston Airfield in Kent and airbursts 6 miles from this position.
It was commissioned, it was directed and finished and made and edited, and then the BBC got cold feet and decided not to screen it. And after that, it was only ever shown In some cinemas, it was shown in labour clubs, places, sort of other than cinemas as well, trade union gatherings, things like that. It became very difficult to see unless you were going to slightly more politically motivated events, really. The War Game was perceived as a drama which was, actually the BBC were really frightened of the effect that it might have on the viewers. Remember, this is in the mid-60s. And the fear was, I think there was literally a fear at the BBC that people might commit suicide if they watched the War Game, that it was so disturbing and that it painted such a bleak picture of nuclear Armageddon that it might inspire people to actually kill themselves. This was this was a belief apparently held at the BBC, one of the reasons why the War Game was withdrawn and never shown. So when they finally decided to do something along the same lines in the 1980s, evidently at the top levels of the BBC there must have been discussion about how to...
And skulls.
The director of Threads, Mick Jackson, had already explored the ideas that Threads deals with to some degree in a half-hour documentary which he made the year before in May of 1983. Now this was an episode of a science documentary strand on the BBC called QED, and the episode was called A Guide to Armageddon. It was a half-hour documentary slot looking at the potential effects of a nuclear explosion over London. It took St Paul's Cathedral as the epicentre of the attack, and then looked at the ways in which the blast would affect people several miles, 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, 5 miles out of the centre of London from there. It's a very powerful piece of work in its own right. It has some disturbing images in it which are not used in Threads. I think there's a sequence where you see a butcher's shop with legs of lamb hanging in the windows, and in order to illustrate very graphically what the heat blast would do to human flesh, it shows basically a leg of lamb being scorched and blasted with high temperatures, and you see the skin bursting and splitting and the flesh cooking and the fat bubbling. Whilst the voiceover by Ludovic Kennedy, actually, who's doing the voiceover, is explaining to you that this is what would happen to a human body if it was under the same conditions.
Everywhere inside this 7-mile radius, for example at the shops in Holland Park Avenue, the effect on directly exposed flesh is the same. It behaves like the meat in the butcher's window.
So that pulled no punches, and that was in 1982. Mick Jackson said that the initial idea for A Guide to Armageddon came when he was browsing through newspapers and noticed that there were an increasing number of advertisements in the classified sections of newspapers for fallout shelters of varying degrees of complexity, ranging from relatively cheap shed-like constructions to very elaborate metal tubes like mini submarines that, if you had the money, that you could implant in your garden and supposedly ride out the worst of the attack. He hit on the idea initially of doing a kind of consumer's guide to these devices, to these products. Consumer programs were very popular at the time, programs that would scrutinise the effectiveness of various consumer products and compare them. So he was kind of drawing on that almost in a sort of a slightly satirical way, I guess, initially, but looking at these often very expensive fallout shelters and subjecting them to scientific examination to see whether or not they'd stand up to the rigours of an actual attack.
And William is safe.
Once he got his teeth into that idea, he started shooting a lot more material, lots more ideas started to flood out. And there was really too much to use in a half-hour slot. So consequently, having done the half-hour QED episode, he was left with a lot of research materials and a lot of ideas about things which he wanted to take further, and that's how Threads developed. The relationship between the Soviet Union and America was at an all-time low. It was certainly at the lowest since the Cuban Missile Crisis. There had been a number of events that had taken place in the early 80s which had led, really, the world to the brink of nuclear confrontation and nuclear annihilation. There was one event that happened in September of 1983 where a Russian military officer called Stanislav Petrov had been monitoring a computer system as an early warning system indicating American missiles. He got a positive on the readout, as it turns out a false positive. It was a computer glitch caused apparently by reflections from the satellites off the sides of clouds, I believe was the explanation ultimately for this. But His instructions were that he ought to pass immediately the information from the computer to high command in preparation for a counter-strike. He took a kind of executive decision unilaterally on his belief that it was a false positive, that it was a computer glitch, and he was right. But if he'd done as he was supposed to do and passed that information up the chain, it's quite possible that there would have been a Soviet response to this ghostly American attack, and who knows where that would have led. Well, I think we can probably guess where that would have led, because the Americans would have responded in kind. In September '83, there was also an instance where the Soviets shot down a Korean aircraft, a commercial aircraft, believing that it was encroaching on their airspace, and there was some problem with radio frequencies and the people on the plane wasn't communicating properly. It drifted into Soviet airspace and was shot down by the military with the loss of about 269 people. Among the 269 people who died in that terrible event was the governor of the state of Georgia, an American politician. Obviously, this meant that the tension between America and the Soviet Union became even worse as a result of this situation. The Soviet news agency TASS tried to deny that there'd been any wrongdoing or that there'd been any kind of error on the part of the Soviets, which fanned the flame of outrage in America. Then 2 months later, in November of the same year, in 1983, a NATO exercise was detected by the Russians, who believed that it was actually a genuine military advance. And again, they were on the brink of a nuclear response, believing that they were under attack. That was prevented at the last moment. They realized at the last moment that, in actual fact, it was a NATO exercise, not the real thing. Simulation of responses to a possible nuclear attack in this country. And this was arranged by Whitehall. It was extremely hush-hush. And it involved an amazingly elaborate series of responses, even to the point of writing a speech for the Queen and a speech for Margaret Thatcher. In the Queen's speech, she was to have announced that, that to be drawing on imagery of the Blitz and saying that as the Queen, with memories of the outbreak of the Second World War, she had hoped never to see anything like it, but now we were having to draw upon the same reserves of pluck and courage in the face of a new, terrifying adversary. Thatcher's speech was a lot more pugnacious and aggressive and concentrated on a counter-response.
The ladies not for turning.
All these things were written in advance and have only recently come to light because of the Freedom of Information Act, and you can now see the text of the speech that the Queen was supposed to deliver to the country when it was decided that we were going to be entering a nuclear war. He went from directing BBC dramas to working in Hollywood. He directed LA Story with Steve Martin. He made The Bodyguard with Whitney Houston. He's had a kind of an unusual, very varied career. So as well as Mick Jackson as director, one of obviously the most significant people involved in Threads is the writer, who's Barry Hines. Now, Barry Hines is very well known in this country for having written a novel called A Kestrel for a Knave, which was made into a film by Ken Loach called Kes. And Barry Hines worked very closely with Loach on the film, and then a few years later he wrote a drama for the BBC called The Price of Coal. Again, this was directed by Ken Loach. I think it was a play for today, but it was in two parts, so it was quite a long piece of work. He'd also written a novel called Looks and Smiles, which again was adapted by Ken Loach. Essentially, Barry Hines and Ken Loach had a very well-established working relationship. I think in some ways, apparently, this led Barry Hines to expect a certain kind of freedom to interact with the filming on Threads, which wasn't to Mick Jackson's liking, and I think it led to some tension between the two men. A big part of the impact of it as well is that you're dealing with people that you've not seen very much before. I mean, the actors who are in this were relatively new to television, or were the kinds of character actor that have been doing smaller roles or unspectacular roles, supporting roles in television for several years. Nobody there are no stars in Threads, which is another big difference with the Day After. The Day After has got recognisable stars like John Lithgow and Steve Guttenberg. Threads, you don't have any familiar faces. Apparently, Mick Jackson, the director, toyed with the idea initially of casting the film entirely from the cast of Coronation Street. I'm glad he didn't do that, to be honest. I think that would have turned it into a bit of a sideshow in a way. It would have been difficult to carve a niche for the programme without having this slightly kitsch element of Coronation Street stars kind of appearing in it. So he decided not to do that and went with a relatively unknown cast. So the principal member of the cast in terms of her dramatic importance to the story is Karen Mager, who plays Ruth. Now, Ruth is the character who's pregnant, gets pregnant fairly early on in the story. And a lot of the horror and a lot of the anxiety that we feel as we progress through the film is based on this really terrible situation she finds herself in as a woman carrying a baby in a world that has gone to hell, where there's no, where you wouldn't wish a child born into a world like this, and yet she's carrying this child into. The critical response to Threads in this country was very positive. A great proportion of the news coverage was highly appreciative of the way that the film had been made. It inspired a lot of debate. There was a strong feeling that the rigorous scientific accuracy that had been brought to bear on the subject was admirable and had been done properly. The day after Threads was transmitted, a programme called On the Eighth Day was transmitted on the BBC, which was a sort of a panel programme designed to discuss the issues that had been raised by the programme.
On November the 1st, 1983, Moscow and Washington were linked by satellite and television for a most unusual scientific conference.
The programme had a variety of scientific and political thinkers participating, but the government itself declined to take part in the discussion, which gives you some idea really of the attitude in government to Threads. Thatcher and her cabinet were not sympathetic to arguments against nuclear proliferation. Thatcher was very much a devotee of Ronald Reagan's way of doing things, and Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan had struck up a very close accord in the early part of the 80s. I think a member of the British Medical Association wrote to her about Britain's preparations for nuclear attack and talked about Threads and received a very terse reply from her office saying, "I'm very well aware of how bad a nuclear war would be," and the rest of the response was basically a reiteration of Conservative policy on the subject. So Threads didn't